Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to the Daily Check-In for August 18th, 2020. That means it's Tuesday, and that means it's Terraform Tuesday. So we're going to have an exciting one today. I'm going to dive a little bit into what is currently a work in progress. It's the Terraform Active Directory provider, and that's not Azure Active Directory. That is OG Windows Active Directory, managing that with Terraform. That's a thing that you can do. Sort of. I mean, there's a lot of caveats there, so we'll get into those in a little bit. Housekeeping items. I am in the process of updating my Terraform certification guide for the new version 0.13. So I started updating it this morning and realized, oh, wow, I'm going to have to rewrite a bunch of things about how providers work because that's a major shift in how third-party providers work. Now you can go to a registry and get them, which is exciting, but also means a bunch of additional writing for me. So that'll be interesting, but I will get that updated and let you know when it is ready to go. If you buy it now, actually, you'll get the update when it comes out because that's how LeanPub works, and that's nice. So that's my housekeeping item. Other things, well, I guess that's it. So let's check in. How's it going? Welcome to Tuesday. I want to share this because this is awesome. My wife went on Old Navy, and I'm not getting paid by Old Navy for this, but they have masks with tacos on them. And it's part of a pack, so you have to buy a pack with some other stuff. But yeah, I have a mask with a taco on it, or multiple tacos now. And I mean, granted, it's a beef taco, and that's not my favorite kind, but still, like, exciting that I have that. I'm excited that's a thing that exists. So pretty awesome there. Let's dive into the topic. Let's talk about this Terraform Active Directory provider. So the first thing you got to know is that this is very much a work in progress. It's not even like a 1.0 style provider. They are actively updating it and changing it and adding functionality and trying to, get this a thing that could be used in production. But for the moment, it's still very much don't set this up in production, please. Pretty please. And the documentation needs a little love, and I was hoping to maybe get to that later this week to help them out with some of the documentation because it doesn't really step you through the process of getting things set up. So with those caveats out of the way, why don't I go ahead and share my screen here? There we go. And now we're looking at Visual Studio Code, and this is not Visual Studio Code running locally. This is Visual Studio Code running directly on a domain controller. I used a template that's available in the Azure Quick Starts to spin up a domain controller in Microsoft Azure using the domain tf.local. And it's basically an empty domain controller. It's sitting all by itself. And when I'm done, I can just destroy it because that's the kind of environment that I wanted to test this out. And before you even use the provider, there's a few things you have to set up on the domain controller to make it work. So I created this PS1 file that has the things you need to do to get it to work. Right now, the only authentication that is supported is basic authentication. So you can't use NTLM, which you shouldn't anyway. You also can't use Kerberos-based authentication for this provider, which for me is kind of a problem because that's what I would typically use for an Active Directory. It is using WinRM to talk to the domain controller. And for right now, it's using HTTP and 5985 by default. So it's not using a secured channel. You can change those settings in the provider to use HTTPS and 5986, which I think is the encrypted port for WinRM. But all that aside, if we look at what's in the stuff you gotta do.ps1, this is changes you have to make. WinRM has to be running. So the template I used has WinRM running, but if you don't, you can use WinRM quick config. That'll get WinRM running. That's remote management. And then the next thing that you have to do is you have to allow unencrypted, because remember, this is using HTTP, and it's the only way I could get this to work. So you have to use the WinRM set command to set allow unencrypted to true. That's two things. The third thing you have to do is because it's using basic authentication, you have to use WinRM set to set the auth methods that are available. You have to set basic to true because by default, basic authentication is disabled. So you have to do all of those things before you use the provider, and none of this is documented. So it could be very confusing and frustrating when you first try to use it if you don't figure this stuff out. Once you get that all running, The next thing is to do is get the credential that you want to use. And in my case, I am just using a get-credential to do this. And I've stored my credentials in a variable called admin user. And then I take the username and password and I shove those into a Terraform variable and use an environment variable to handle that variable. So the environment variable is tfvar underscore winrm underscore username and winrm password. So that's what I have set up in my configuration. I have two different configurations here. I have one that will get an OU out of the existing, so it's using a data source type, and the other one will create 3 users. So let's look at what's in the main.tf for the OU. All right, so the first thing is I'm using the newer syntax to get this provider, and it is pulling it down from the official HashiCorp Terraform registry. And I'm using required providers and listing the AD provider as the required provider. And I'm saying I want version 0.1.0, which was the current version yesterday. That may have changed when you see this, but that's the current version as of right now. And then I'm setting up some variables here for the WinRM password, username, and host name. So how can it talk to this service? And then in the provider, you have to list out these settings. And again, the documentation isn't great around this. So hopefully this is helpful if you wanted to dive in and try to use this thing yourself. In the provider, you have to define the WinRM host name, the WinRM password, and the WinRM username. Now I have 2 more settings in here, WinRM port and WinRM proto, which defines the port and protocol. By default, it's 5985 in HTTP, so I have those settings in there, but if I left them out, it would still use those by default. I was messing around with using 5986 in HTTPS, which is why they're in there. And then we get down to actually getting a data source. And so I want to get an OU out of Active Directory. So the data source type is AD underscore OU. And then we're just calling it G. And then I have to give the distinguished name where this OU can be found. And so I grabbed that straight from the advanced properties of the Active Directory users and computers. And then I'm going to output the UUID or the GUID of this OU as output. So let's go ahead and go into the get OU and we'll run, I think I've already run Terraform in it, but I'll run it again. It doesn't matter. It's not going to hurt anything. All right, so that's good. And then we can just simply run Terraform apply and it should go through its whole thing. Now I turned on debug level tracing on this because I was running into a lot of issues and I wasn't sure why I was running into these issues. So if you're ever trying to troubleshoot a plugin, this is helpful. And what ended up happening, what I ended up discovering was that it is actually using PowerShell commands when it's running this. So if we scroll up a little bit, hopefully we can find it in here, where it's actually creating the PowerShell command. Yes. Okay, here's the command. So if we look here under debug, it says running command get AD object properties identity, and it gives the name of the OU that it's trying to get. It converts it to JSON, and then it submits the encoded command using PowerShell. So that is what it's actually doing. This provider is using PowerShell. So if you're familiar with AD PowerShell, you might actually be able to help them further develop this plugin. Who knows? So that's what it's doing, and it returned that OU ID. So this, I mean, obviously, that's probably not very helpful in a real-world context, but if you did want to get an OU and then populate it with something, then it could be helpful. The next thing that I did is I created this configuration main.tf for making users. And so this is actually going to create some resources. So again, the provider's the same, the variables are the same, and then I created this locals pattern, and I'm going to use a for each loop in the create AD user portion and loop through this map of different users. So I've got 3 users laid out here with a principal name, a SAM account name, display name, and the container I want that user created in. And then if we scroll down a little bit more, the resource type is AD user. I'm using a for each loop to loop through a list of users that's defined in local.users. And then within that, I'm giving each user the principal name, SAM account name, display name, the container they should go in, which is the OU they should be created in, and then an initial password. And the documentation doesn't really call out that you have to have an initial password, otherwise it fails, because Active Directory is like, what's the password for this thing? So that's basically what it does. If we go look at AD users and computers and look in TF users, which is where I'm creating the users, there's no users there right now. So I can simply do the same thing over again and just do, well, I got to go in the right directory first. That would be helpful. So we'll go into, what did I call this? Make users. Well, that's pretty straightforward. And I already initialized, so we can do Terraform apply here. It'll walk through the whole thing, see if I want to do it. I'll say yes, and it should create 3 users using the encoded commands. We go back and refresh our view. There's our 3 users. We're all good. Now, if I want to get rid of those users, let's say for whatever reason they were test users and now I want to get rid of them, I can do Terraform destroy, auto approve, and now those 3 users will be removed from the OU. There we go. Okay. All the users are now gone. So pretty cool stuff. There's a bunch of different resources. There's users, groups, OUs. I think GPOs might have been in there. And then there's data sources for all of those as well. And you can create computers too. So definitely some possibilities, but definitely still rough around the edges. I'd like to, hear what you think. And if this was useful to you, understanding how all of this works. So hit me up in the comments or hit me up on Twitter, LinkedIn, and let me know what you thought of this particular video. And if you want me to do additional like deep dive provider videos, or if there's something else about Terraform that you want to know more about, let me know. I'm happy to do a new video. So that's all I have for today. Tomorrow is Wednesday. So it is, tech analysis. I don't know what I'm going to talk about, but it'll be a surprise for you and me.